Hey Kim, so I'm giving my quick little spiel on the resource that I selected from my bedroom. It's a tad bit messy right now, but this is just little context. This is the quote board because I work in residence, so this is for my staff. We just say fun quotes and stuff like that happen during meetings just to keep things a little bit more exciting. So if you're confused as to what's behind me, that's what that is. So the resource that I chose, it's not a social justice resource itself. I chose to use the resource that I'm actually teaching with right now in my English class, and that's the book that you hoped we wouldn't have to deal with, but it's To Kill a Mockingbird. So I showed up, they were already about maybe 2 weeks into the unit. They were on chapter 13 when I arrived, and we've been working through the novel so far. So I found this pretty difficult for myself just because I know a lot of the articles publishing right now are talking about how it's not appropriate to be used in classrooms. We've talked about it in our own class. And it's given me that different perspective on this book. This was also a book I have not read since I did it in grade 10 or grade 9 myself. So I wasn't overly familiar with the text. But because I started into this novel already 2 weeks in, I wasn't fully sure what kind of prep work and groundwork the teacher had already laid out. What kind of stuff was she talking about to make this more appropriate? How was she navigating some of the terms and phrases? Basically the entire material as a whole, especially because she is in a predominantly white classroom, and by predominantly, I'd say 99%, if not every single student, is of some form of European background. So it definitely was an interesting experience for myself. So just a quick kind of summary of the purpose of this book. It's part of the grade 10 curriculum that they have at their school. Every single teacher uses it. It's their big kind of critical literacy novel that they analyze every single chapter. The students have an entire independent research project that's actually based around this text. So that's at my high school, we called it a culminating activity. They call it an ISU. They have to create a scrapbook discussing the themes that are prevalent in this novel. So there is that little bit more of a critical literacy at lens, because they do go into the topics of racism and some similar kind of things as they are going through the critical lens of this. But the book itself, I had to reread it myself because I was not very, very good at remembering what it was about. My memory was a little bit rusty. The book itself, as I'm sure you're aware, it follows a 6-year-old scout. It's basically just her perspective as her father is defending a person of color, Tom Robinson, who's been accused of rape. And in the novel, it's made pretty evident that it was a false accusation. There's definitely a lot of material that's supporting the fact that it was a false accusation, and it's kind of Scout's perspective of coming to terms with the fact that the world is a little bit of an uglier place than we had thought it was, or that she had thought it was. As far as what I would personally use this material for is I wouldn't. I think maybe in a grade 12 class, this book could potentially be used to discuss the fact that times have changed. I don't know if I would build an entire unit around it, but perhaps have students read it independently over the course of a week and then run like one lesson or two on why they think this book isn't relevant anymore and why this book shouldn't be used in classrooms anymore would probably be the only angle that I would take if I were to be using this in a future classroom. However, I am also aware of the fact that this novel is very prevalent in high school. It was taught in my high school for every single student. It's taught to every single student at the high school that I'm at right now. Basically, as far as I'm aware, it's taught to almost any student in Ontario. It's basically an unannounced version of the English curriculum. It's assumed that you'll learn it. So, well, I wouldn't personally use it, and if I were to be to the grade 12 class, I have come to terms with the fact that this is typically used with grade 10 English students, both academic and applied. So that's where it's most used, not necessarily the best, but we have to make do with what we have. Some of the voices that this resource takes into account or does not take into account, well, it doesn't really take into account any people of color's voices. They are very much background characters in this novel. The most prevalent one is Calpurnia. You hardly ever hear her perspective on Tom Robinson's case. You hear a little bit of Reverend Sykes. He's the pastor at the Church for People of Color. And you hear his perspective a little bit at the trial where he just talks about the fact that an all-white jury would never acquit a person of color. But in reality, this book does not do their perspective justice at all. It doesn't really dive into their emotions behind being basically recently freed from slavery, having more equal rights. It doesn't dive into their voices behind how they find segregation. It doesn't dive into how they view the racism. You don't get Tom Robinson's perspective on how he's handling the fact that he's being falsely accused. It's outlined that it sounds like he's a pretty good person because he was trying to just help Mayala Ewell out by doing some chores for her, and that's what got him into this situation. But it doesn't go into his perspective and like what he's thinking about now that the tables have turned on him. He was doing something nice, and then all of a sudden he was arrested for it. It doesn't really dive into his psyche or what that would feel like. The author itself, as talked about in lots of different recent articles, she was also a white woman, so her perspective not really isn't really coming from the perspective of people that would have been going through this. She was writing it she wrote the novel in 1960 about just because of the lynch mobs that were happening at the time. But then she brought it back. I think this book was taking place in the 30s. Yeah, I think it was the 30s for this novel. So her lived experience is definitely not there. I think if we were to be discussing a novel such as this, I think we should absolutely be using a novel that is both written by someone who's a person of color who can have a bit more of that lived experience, but also we should focus on the person of color actually telling the story. So maybe the author themselves isn't, but it's centered on somebody who is a person of color, and that way we can see their experience through their lens in a novel like this. I think it would be really cool. I don't know if there's a novel out there that would follow the Tom Robinson's perspective. I'm sure somebody has thought about writing that. I think that could be a really cool spin. But there are a ton of other novels out there that if you want to talk about the topics of racism and take that critical lens in class, this book just isn't the best one to do it. So there's the Book of Negroes, there's Hidden Figures, there's countless others that I can't even think of. If you want to go into even a more diverse background, you could do something like The Kite Runner or A Thousand Splendid Suns. I love A Thousand Splendid Suns. But there's tons and tons and tons of different books that focus on people from different backgrounds. If that is the purpose of a novel that you're trying to read, that would do it just so much better justice than this novel here does when you're talking about these materials. I think the biggest struggle that I've had on my placement so far is how I'm attempting to tackle presenting this novel. So a bit of kind of like my reflection on this book. It's not so much maybe from me reviewing it with a critical eye, because I have had already reviewed it with a critical eye through some of the articles and stuff like that I've read. I think for me, what I learned the most from is the experience of actually having to teach with this novel and teach following the expectations that my placement teacher has for this book. So I've really been struggling with, I've been trying to tie it in as best as possible to modern stuff and getting perspectives. Recently, I had my students do seminar presentations on each chapter, and they were supposed to end with a thought-provoking question. And I was trying to talk to them because someone's question was on racism in some capacity. I can't remember what it was exactly. And all of my students were talking about how it's not a problem here, but let's use examples like over in the States. Like, let's talk about all the racist problems that are happening over there. So I tried to go into a little bit of a lesson after that to address some of the issues that they were talking about on the fact that, nope, like Canada definitely has a racism problem as well. There's lots of accounts of people being carded just due to their race, of police assaulting people of color. It is definitely still a very evident issue in Canada. It just doesn't quite get the same press that the States does. And I actually got scolded a little bit by my teacher afterwards. She thought that material might have been a bit too mature for my students, and that it wasn't necessarily appropriate for them to be discussing something like that, which surprised me. It really threw me off, because if they're not going to learn about that when they're in grade 10, so they're already 15, 16 years old, there's no guarantee that they're going to learn it in university. They might not go to post-secondary, so they might not learn those other perspectives, and it shouldn't be the onus of other teachers to teach it to them. If I have the opportunity to have that learning moment with my students, I think it is my duty to enlighten them and teach them a little bit, and maybe not necessarily show them that they're wrong, because their perspective still might be right, but make them open to more different perspectives. That's something that I've been struggling with as a whole. We also ran into that problem a little bit when they were talking about there was the implied sexual assault that occurred to Maya Ewell in this novel by her father. And then some of my students started to talk about the Me Too movement, and then they were talking about what happened in Ireland with the girl when the type of underwear that she was wearing was used in a court case against her. And a ton of my male students were just all talking, laughing about it, did not understand why it was relevant to them because it was happening across an ocean. It wasn't even in a country nearby, and just thought that it was ridiculous that people were so bothered by what was going on over there. Then I decided to address that in my following lesson. And so I prepared a PowerPoint that was going to critically look at different photos, and I was going to talk about how like sexual assault and how some of the gender sexism and gender separation and all of that are so prevalent in our society, and how that also was a factor in the novel. So I was still tying it back to the book, and I got shut down. I was not allowed to give that presentation because the material was considered too mature to talk about consent. Basically, I was trying to turn it back into a little bit of a consent talk, and it was still considered too mature. So that's what I've been struggling a lot with teaching this novel, is because I didn't get to intro it. I don't know what kind of groundwork was laid to talk about what's right, what's wrong, what we're kind of trying to look at when we look into this book. And whenever I'm trying to then add to that or lay my own little bit of groundwork on how I want my students to be critically thinking about this novel, I'm getting shut down, and I'm not able to kind of address it and talk about it the way that I want to. And I know, Kim, you talk a lot in your class about the fact that this, our first little bit of time, it's not the time for social justice and equity, it's the time just to get a job, and you can worry about trying to change the system once you're inside it and all of that stuff. And that's great, and I'm starting to get it now, because it's hard. It's hard to change things, especially when you're younger, when you don't have the seniority. And like for myself, like I have to do what my placement teacher says at the end of the day. So that's a little bit about just what I've been going through. I know I did this presentation a little bit different. I know you had wanted us to critically evaluate a social justice resource, but I hope that you still accept the fact that evaluating this novel is still significant, because this is the resource that I'm teaching with in my classroom right now, the resource that I'm most teaching with in my class. So that's why I thought that this would be a nice little presentation, just focusing on To Kill a Mockingbird and the problems that are arising from me having to teach this to my grade 10 white class. And it's been interesting. It's been fun. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I can't wait to see you back in January. I'm really missing your class. I hope you have a great holiday break, and see you in the new year. Bye.